long the entire process took and how much money it cost your family, if you don't mind sharing that.
Right. It took me 20 years from the time we arrived in Charlotte to the time that I took the oath as a U.S. citizen. 20 years and about 4 months. And Bruce and I calculated when we wrote our book, we calculated that we had probably spent in the region of $450,000 on being American.
You are listening to Stories from Real Life, a podcast by engaging storytellers for engaged story listeners. Here's your host, author and journalist, Melvin E. Edwards.
Hello again, and welcome to this December 17th edition of Stories from Real Life. I'm your host, Melvin E. Edwards. Thanks for joining me on today's storytelling journey. My guest this week is Dianne Ennis Stewart. Good morning, Dianne, and welcome to this week's podcast.
Hey, Melvin, that music can only put you in a good mood. Yes, good morning to you, and thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you for allowing me to be a guinea pig. It's the first time I've ever played that live for a guest, because normally I add that in post-production. So it seemed to go off without a hitch.
Sure did.
So as listeners heard in the introduction that I gave for you, you are a native of South Africa. I'm tempted to quote the line from Mean Girls, where the South African student is asked why she's white.
You white? Oh my God, Karen, you can't just ask people why they're white.
I won't do that today, and I don't know if you've heard of that movie, but I am curious if you've described yourself as African American.
Oh, interesting question. I describe myself as a South African American, but it's more complicated than that because I'm actually an Irish citizen and an American citizen and a South African citizen. So it's I haven't really put a label on myself. My husband kind of jokes with people when they meet him and he gets that line, why are you white? You're from Africa. What's up with this? And he then says, well, I'm a true African American. I'm born in Africa and now an American. So it is kind of a fun thing, but obviously it has serious connotations here. And I see myself as an American now. I chose America. I wanted to be here from a very small girl. And so I consider myself an American with South African heritage and Irish heritage.
Oh, that's very, very interesting. So this episode will be about immigration policy of the United States under multiple presidents. And then obviously we will weave your own personal story throughout these narratives. So at the end of apartheid, 20% of the South African population was white. Now 30 years later, it's only 8%. So why did you and your family leave South Africa?
Well, we left not for the obvious reasons the obvious reasons that you're inferring. We lived, I remember very clearly in 1994, standing in a long line and voting in a referendum to free Nelson Mandela, which was overwhelmingly voted for by white people and colored people, which I'll explain later, the colored people from the Western Cape. And Indian people, we voted overwhelmingly to free him. And a couple of months later, he was in fact freed. And then it took 4 years of negotiation with the previous apartheid government to have a peaceful transfer of power, which we ultimately did have, which was extraordinary at the time because the rest of the world was expecting us to have, a violent transfer of power. And it was a very peaceful transfer. And I was lucky enough to be involved in that process. I was doing the PR and marketing for them, dealing with media around the world. The talks were held at at a place that was called the World Trade Center, and so it was a very large place that could accommodate a lot of meeting rooms and a lot of media. And so I spent a lot of time there helping to get the word out of what was happening on that particular day. And then fast forward to 94, my son was born in 94, and in fact, he was born on Madiba's birthday, July 18th. And I took Michael up to see Madiba, as we call him, because he was having his eye surgery done on a floor above me in the same hospital. And I took him up to meet him, and it was quite a special moment, as you can imagine, because he was born on the same day. And that's kind of a reminder every time Michael has a birthday, I think back on that day. So we were very comfortable. We were very hardworking. We had two businesses that we'd run for many years. And so we had no desire to leave South Africa at all. So I was not leaving my country for any reason other than economic. What happened was my husband's business grew and matured to such a degree that he had basically done everything he could have done in South Africa. And so he needed to look further afield to grow his business. And he noticed, because it was early days with the internet in those days, the early 90s, that people were finding him on his website, which was unusual for somebody to have a website in the early 90s. And he was getting inquiries from all over the world, including a lot from the US. And so we kind of idly said to one another, oh, well, if we get a visa, we might go and spend a couple of years there and build a business there, and we can always come back to South Africa. Well, as they say, life happens. And we arrived in the we applied for visas and we forgot about it. And literally within a couple of weeks, we were granted an intercompany transfer, which is otherwise known as an L1 visa. So basically, you're transferring yourself from one company to another company in the United States. And that happened very quickly. And I was kind of completely bowled over because I said, there's no way that I can move so fast. I need at least 6 to 8 months to organize my life, sort out my business. There's no way. So we decided to delay it, and we ultimately left South Africa in July 2001. And that was in itself a momentous date, because literally 3 months later we had 9/11. So we had a baptism of fire literally as we arrived. And my family were on the phone saying, you're coming back, right? You're not going to stay in the US if they're being attacked. And I said, well, no, I think we've come and we need to give it our best shot. And so that's kind of how that happened. And that's really the start of my journey here.
Wow, that's already interesting. So let's touch on President Mandela a little bit more. So other than meeting him with his eye surgery and your son's birth, did you have any other interactions with him?
At that time, or
at any point?
Yeah, oh yes, yes. Point. After that, I was honored enough to obviously see him quite often at various events. I was well known in South Africa. I used to be on TV, and I had a large PR and marketing company, so I did a lot of special events. And then I was honored to be with him and do the international media with him on Robben Island during the 2000 celebrations, the Millennium celebrations, where they went around the world and they interviewed famous people in various parts of the world. I don't know whether you recall that. And so I worked on that media event, and so I actually found myself at one point in his cell with him on Robben Island, and he lit a candle in the cell, which was very profound. And then obviously after that, I left 6 months later. So that was my last interaction with him.
Okay, so that was in 2000.
Yeah.
Okay. So during your immigration journey to the United States, it took a long time. There were a lot of details that we'll explore throughout this episode. But how did you end up in Ireland after your immigration journey to the United States began?
Well, we came, as I said, on a non-immigrant visa, which is not a visa that grants you a green card. You're not staying permanently. You're coming to do business, and then you're going to go home to your home country in a period of years. What happened was we made a very common mistake where we trusted the attorney. We trusted the advice that we were given, and it was the incorrect advice. If we had been given the broad spectrum of immigration opportunities to us, or different visa paths that we could have undertaken, we would not have done the L1 visa, because we had no idea that it was going to be problematic for us. We were told that we could possibly get a green card at the, while we were on this non-immigrant visa, but it was never guaranteed in any way. It was never a certainty, and it turned out to be a complete nightmare for us. So if somebody had said to me back in 1999 that I could have come here on a green card from the beginning, from the get-go, obviously I would have gone that route, because there's no ways that I would have gone through what I went through for 12 years and then have to physically self-deport myself to stay legal. In other words, I was not prepared to break any of the US immigration laws, so we literally packed up a 4-bedroomed house, shut down 2 businesses, and took ourselves out of the country. And we decided to go to Ireland because we thought South Africa was a long way away and we could probably get a visa and come back to the United States in a short time. Well, that was another misconception that we had, and that rolled out a whole nother saga. So that was really the reason, because Ireland is a relatively short flight from Charlotte, which is where we've lived ever since we've been here. And so we thought that Ireland would be the best place for us, and that's how we decided to self-deport ourselves there.
Okay, did it make the process easier because you were an Irish citizen, or did you become an Irish citizen at that point?
No, Bruce's father, very interestingly, and this is an interesting little piece of our story. When Bruce was born, my husband was born in 1951 in South Africa. Things were rosy in South Africa. They were still part of the Crown. They were still part of England. And for some reason, Bruce's father, in his extreme wisdom, registered all his children as Irish foreign births. We'd never got the opportunity to ask him why he did that. We should have. But for some reason, he thought that maybe a passport like that would be useful in the future. And it was incredible how useful it became, because as it happened, I think it was mid-2012, we needed our passports to leave the country, and our South African passports had expired. And so we couldn't leave the country on those passports. And in the interim, it had become very difficult to get renewals of passports from South Africa. It could take months or even years. So there was no chance that we could have renewed those passports in time to leave the United States within the period that we had to leave. And lo and behold, there were these Irish passports that were valid, that were given to us literally 50 years before, which was extraordinary.
That's really fascinating. So
you've endured, when you say things are meant to be, sorry, Mama.
Absolutely. That's okay. So after all that you've endured on your immigration journey and all the money you had to spend, why are you so certain the United States was a place you should be, you wanted to be?
As a small girl, I've asked myself that question a lot. And my father was an accountant, and he took a job in what was formerly known as Southwest Africa, which is now Namibia, a very beautiful, untouched, exquisite country that I would urge people to visit if they've never been to, one of the last wildernesses in the world. It's absolutely exquisite, and it's safe. And so I was living there with my parents. I was 8 years old, and I was living a great childhood. We were fishing on the skeleton coast of Namibia, which is just amazing. My father was a great fisherman, and he would take us on these outings over the weekends, and he'd go fishing and we'd play in the dunes. And I started to sew a pair of jeans that I had into a purse. I don't know whether you remember those days. It was the 60s. I don't know whether you're old enough to remember, but the 60s were lots of embroidery, peace signs, and I embroidered. I made this jean bag with a long shoulder strap, and I embroidered on it a large American flag. And about 10 years ago, my mom gave me this bag. She had kept it all these years. And so I have it. I have this bag.
Wow.
And I embroidered this American flag on it. And I often wonder why I did that. So it was clearly in my psyche that I was interested in the US. I was wanting to visit. And I only visited for the first time in 1987. So it was a long time between 1967 and 1987. 20 years later, I finally got to the US. And I really felt, and I'm a person of faith, and so I prayed about it a lot. And when I drove into Charlotte, I knew that this is where God wanted me to be. And I looked at my husband and I said, this is where we are going to be. This is where we are meant to be.
Wow.
So I had a very clear vision of where I had to be. And I had learned over many mistakes in my life to be obedient to that little voice telling me that this is what I want you to do. So that's how I ended up here. And that was the best decision. The only great decision that we made to come to Charlotte.
And I'm sure you've learned a lot of lessons being as part of the American South and how the past is still very relevant today. Tell me what are some of the similarities between South Africa and the American South?
Well, interesting that you should ask that, because when I first arrived, I met a fabulous woman called Harriet Sanford, who was the executive director of the Arts and Science Council here, and she knew a lot about South Africa. And my impression when I first got to Charlotte, as you can imagine, the buckle of the Bible Belt, in the previous segregated South, the first thing that hit me was that everything was still segregated. The churches were segregated. People lived in different parts of the city. They went to different restaurants. It was clear that there was still very much an active segregated lifestyle here. And that kind of shocked me, because coming from South Africa, we'd always viewed America as being, the leader in civil rights, the leader of integration, the literally the gold standard in people, getting past their racism. And so that was strange for me. And so after lots of conversations with Harriet, we decided, or both of us decided, that we needed to do an interesting program to compare the segregated South with apartheid South Africa. And we put together a foundational, or different foundations got involved, different arts organizations got involved, and we did lots of exhibitions, music events, and very importantly, we had something called, what did we call it? It was something like conversations that haven't been had before. And we got Black and white Americans together to share their stories. And it was the first time that anything like that had happened in Charlotte. And people were sobbing. People opened up completely. People shared what they thought of white people. People shared what they thought about Black people. And it was an incredible experience. And so much so that it actually won some national awards. The whole program won some national awards for the Levine Museum of the New South. Yeah, so that was kind of the first. I did that in the first couple of years. I think it was 2003 that we did it. And that exhibition actually traveled around the country.
All right, so what are some of the similarities? What were the first things, other than the segregation, that you saw within the day-to-day life? What are some of the other similarities you saw?
The non-communication between Black Americans and white Americans, the fact that they were never able to involve themselves in direct conversation with one another. In South Africa, we lived very closely with Black people. Remember, we were the minority. So Black people were living in our homes, working in our homes to a far greater degree than they were in the segregated South. Here, they were very much below. They were owned by slave owners. Our last 100 years didn't have that in South Africa. We did have certain slaves in certain periods of South Africa, but nothing like what you had here. So Black people that worked for white people were paid. They were never enslaved. And so that mindset, I just felt that we were luckily to have been much closer together in living together, raising our children together with them, raising their children together with my children. Lives are very intertwined with Black people in South Africa, far more than what they are here even today in the United States.
Wow. That's jaw-dropping. You would think that after this amount of time, we would have made enough progress to make it obvious to somebody who's a newcomer to our society, but apparently we still have we still have a long ways to go.
Right, and I think that when people say that there's racism in South Africa, I had never experienced racism in South Africa to the extent that I've experienced it here, which I find interesting.
Wow.
South African blacks are incredibly friendly, smiley, welcome. How are you doing, ma'am? Just very sweet, warm, lovely people. Very much like Madiba. Very much they embody what the man was, and that's common. I am family members that have worked for my family and for my sister's family, my mom, they are family members. They are, we go to their funerals, we go to their weddings, we go to their graduations. It's a much closer relationship than I've seen anywhere else here.
Wow, that's I keep saying that's interesting and that's fascinating, but it really is interesting and fascinating. So I'd like to explore that a little bit more. But let's move on to the next question. Why do you think so many people still want to immigrate to the United States every year?
Well, I always tell people, and I get asked that all the time. And I was asked it last week in London because people wanted to know why people still want to come here in the light of our current political situation. And the answer is simple. Successful people around the world are even more successful in the United States because we are one of the only nation in the world that offers unbelievable opportunity, unfettered freedom to do whatever you want to do, obviously within the law. And America has done an incredible PR job on the rest of the world. We have been leading things since I listened to that radio broadcast in 1966 of the first man on the moon on a little transistor radio on the coast of Namibia. And we were glued to it. And so America has always done great and wonderful things, exciting things. They've been the first in so many things. So people have this idea that the streets are paved with gold, and if they come here, it's going to be wonderful and marvelous. Well, of course, they realize that it's not the case when they get here. But many of them who come here, by far the majority of people who come here to work, come here to build something, come here to feed their families, come here to have the honor of having a job and getting a salary or getting a paycheck. And I think that is something that the rest of the world, very few countries around the world can offer.
Well, you probably hear the thunder in the background. Hopefully it won't knock out our power while we're recording here. We got a late fall thunderstorm here that's bringing a cold front. So it finally feels like we're changing seasons here. That'll last for about 3 or 4 days here in South Texas. It'll be 80 degrees again by next week. But hopefully that won't distract us and we'll be able to continue with this great conversation. So my next question is, what are some of the myths about legal immigration in the United States?
Well, I think that the majority of people think that you just need to get in a line and you just need to get in the line, do your paperwork, and all will be well. Well, that is completely false because America has probably one of the most complex and difficult and expensive immigration systems in the world. It is more difficult to immigrate to the United States than to any other country in the world. So it takes huge money. It takes legal expertise from a good attorney or from an attorney. Some people try and do it on their own. They go online and they fill out all the forms and they invariably have issues because they don't understand how the system actually works and what the rules and regulations are. I would say that the INA, which is the Immigration and Naturalization Act, is probably as complex, if not more, than the IRS Act. And so if you think that our IRS is difficult and complex, you ain't seen nothing yet with the Immigration and Naturalization Act. So much so that it is clear why we have so many undocumented immigrants coming to our southern border. It's simply because the system doesn't allow for people to come here in their capacity. There is no visa for somebody coming here to seek work. If you want to work on a farm, you have to apply for a visa that's called an H-2A, and you only get 6 to 9 months in order to do that. Then you've got to go back to your home country. So it's this back and forth situation for menial work. There are other visa categories that you can get, but there's a 2 to 3 to 4 year wait for you to get here. People don't have time in their lives to wait 2 to 4 years to come and earn some money to support their families. So the actual system itself is the cause of our issues at our southern border. In addition to that, there is an act that says if you arrive with your 2 feet on U.S. soil, you are allowed by law to apply for asylum. And asylum is what everybody is applying for when they come through the southern border. Those asylum laws were originally designed for people coming from the Soviet bloc countries where they wanted to escape persecution. They were designed for people who were being persecuted for religious reasons. They were designed for people who were against their government and they needed to get out of there quickly. Navalny would be a perfect example of a true asylee. So by far, and I think it's up to 98% now, by far the asylum seekers that come to our southern border are denied. But they are not, but the deportation that they are then given if they go through the whole process is not carried through. So they end up languishing here without papers. And that's why we have 15 and more million undocumented people here.
Wow. Well, you talked about how you were so diligent about following every letter of the law with the immigration policy that was in place at the time you arrived. Can you tell us a little more about your immigration experience and some of the details so that people understand how exceptional it is to get through even from a country or from a person who might be considered a preferred immigrant?
Right. I mean, in my naivety, I thought that I was the kind of immigrant that America would like. An entrepreneur, self-sufficient, English-speaking, educated, a person of means. I thought that I would be not given preferential treatment, but I would be looked at favorably when I was adjudicated. Well, that clearly wasn't the case because the visa category that I was put into by the attorney was really designed for huge business. It was designed for companies like Mercedes-Benz, Facebook, IBM, just huge companies that were transferring management from one country to another, from a big company to another big company here in a managerial role. That he did not explain to us that a small business, which is really what ours was, we had about 25 people working for us. We were hoping to employ as many people when we got here. And he said, no, that ticks the boxes for the requirements for an L1. And we got the L1 very swiftly. Within 5 weeks of applying, we were given approval for an L1. Now, and I then decided that I wanted an L1 as well. I didn't want something to happen to Bruce and then me as the spouse would have to go back to South Africa without any control. So we came on 2 L1 visas, which means that we could both work in our own capacity. And if anything happened to either of us, we would be, the surviving spouse would be safe. So we did 2 L1 visas. And those L1 visas are valid initially for 1 year. And then you get a renewal for a further 2 years. And then you get a renewal for 3 years. And so in total, 7 years is the duration of that visa. If you do not change your status from that L1 category into a green card, you have to leave the country and go back to your home country. So what happened was, when we realized that we were in fact in the wrong visa category, I let my L1 run for 7 years, and then Bruce then took over with his L1 and we extended it for another 4 years. And then it was kind of, we couldn't do that anymore. So I was the derivative and he was the spouse, and then I was the spouse and he was the derivative. So in 2012, we finally got an attorney who explained to us why our green cards were constantly being denied. So we applied for our green cards probably 3 or 4 times, and each time it was denied. And I could not understand how the denial was based on the criteria that we were given the L1 in the first place. If you look at the act between the L1 and the green card, in order to get the green card, the wording is identical. So my argument was, why did you give me the L1 in the beginning if the criteria for transferring it to a green card is the identical criteria. And after appeals, after legal action, after all sorts, their answer to us was, you shouldn't have got the L1 in the beginning. So you can imagine, you've brought me here under false pretenses, making me think that I qualify for this visa and for a future green card. And yet now you're telling me that I shouldn't have been given that L1 in the beginning. That was infuriating because nobody could explain. My husband and I, were not going to give up easily. We are fighters and we are determined to make things right when we believe them to be wrong. And we never gave up. The two of us never gave up. And so we went to our congresswoman, and she prepared what's called a private bill of Congress. It was the first bill in the history of North Carolina. Bruce actually wrote the bill because he was an attorney in South Africa in a previous life. And he wrote the bill. He gave it to Sue Myrick, who was our congressman at the time. She agreed. She presented it to the judiciary. It went through the judiciary. There was a guy called Lamar Smith, who you might have heard of. He was a Texan. He was a Texan congressman. And he killed it in the judiciary because he said, if we give it to the Stewarts, we have to do it for everybody. And Sue Myrick's argument and our argument was that, but the Stewarts aren't anybody. Bruce was working for the Pentagon. He was a defense contractor. He was in fact, at that very moment, he was consulting with SEAL Team 6, who went on to kill bin Laden. So he was an integral part of the machinations of the U.S. government. And he stood, Lamar Smith stood by his word, and lots of tears later, I can remember sitting in John Boehner's office. I was standing, in his office taking a picture of the Washington Monument behind me, and none of them could do anything to help us. And so we came back to Charlotte, and we had 2 weeks to pack up our entire house, put it into storage. My daughter was, at that point, she'd aged out of our L1 protection, and she was on an F1 visa because she was in college at Greensboro. And Michael, my son, was still in high school, so he could come with us to Ireland. So the three of us left at the end of April 2012, and we flew to Dublin.
Wow.
Very
so
traumatic
can you tell us
day.
how long the entire process took and how much money it cost your family, if you don't mind sharing that?
Right. It took me 20 years from the time we arrived in Charlotte to the time that I took the oath as a U.S. citizen. 20 years and about 4 months. And Bruce and I calculated, when we wrote our book, we calculated that we had probably spent in the region of $450,000 on being American.
Wow. Obviously, somebody who's coming from our southern border, coming from an impoverished background, could not afford that type of a luxury to become a legal citizen. So can you tell us some of the myths about illegal immigration?
Well, as I said earlier, the myth is that people say, well, why don't you go and get legal? Why don't you just do it the right way? Why don't you just go and stand in a line and get your papers? They just think it's just a piece of paper. They don't understand that there are over 100 different visas to come to the U.S. The majority of them are non-immigrant visas, which means they work visas. And there are very few categories. There are only 5 major categories for an immigrant visa, which means a green card. So you get the visa before you get here, and then when you get here, you actually receive your physical green card. And there are only 5 categories of that, and they're called EB1, EB2, EB3, EB4, and EB5. EB1 is for extraordinary ability people like Elon Musk, people like, people that started Google and started Facebook and those kinds of things. EB2 and EB4 are related to famous people like actors, sports people, famous players, famous sportsmen.
First ladies.
First ladies, exactly. Although she came on an EB1 because she had a cover. Okay, and I know that she got an EB1, and I know who did that EB1 for her. So it was legally done. That I can tell you, it was legally done. But she came on that immigrant visa. She didn't marry Donald to get the visa, right? Which I think is a myth. But secondly, the EB2 and the EB4 are, as I said, business and famous people and sportsmen. EB3 is an interesting one. EB3 is for unskilled workers. So companies like Amazon, Coca-Cola, Subway, they apply to the Department of Labor to get, say, 100 workers to come from a foreign country to work in their warehouses, make sandwiches in Alaska, specifically jobs that Americans don't want to do. And they have to prove to the Department of Labor that Americans don't want those jobs and they can't fill those jobs. For example, Amazon drivers. Amazon can never get enough drivers to deliver to all of us that want their stuff an hour later once they've ordered it. So Amazon is a big EB3, but it's a long process. It takes years to process through the consulate of the home country. It's very expensive. The EB3 person has to pay for the recruiting, has to pay for all of it. So you're looking at about $25,000 to $30,000. Now, how many unskilled workers around the world have $30,000 lying around when you've got an exchange rate that is extremely punitive to many countries around the world? So you can see that the actual way of coming to the United States is very difficult and limited. And Americans don't understand that. They don't understand that it's expensive, that it's tedious, that it's often inhumane, which happened in my case where I had to self-deport and it just tore my family apart, had to leave my daughter here. She became very ill while I was in Ireland. I had nobody here to help her. She had to have emergency surgery. They couldn't stop bleeding. It was a very traumatic time for me. And obviously my close friends and the people around me, they all knew about it and they were all horrified as to what we had been put through. But the average American doesn't understand that and doesn't know that. And my opinion of the 11 million or 12 million people that have come here is that they've come here because the jobs have been here for them. Americans have gleefully employed them and become wealthy through them. And it is my very strong opinion that the reason why Congress, for the almost 25 years that I've lived here, do not want to fix the immigration system is because it suits them. It suits America to have an underclass of people that they can pay minimum and even lower wages to do the jobs that America doesn't want to do, that Americans don't want to do. That's how the South, that's how the slavery built America, with free labor. Now we've got almost free labor. So the whole thing is kind of a symptom of what grinds, what makes this machine called American economy run. I know that's controversial, but I believe that is the case because I've seen it with my own eyes. They've had the opportunity to fix it and they haven't. On either side. I blame both sides.
Wow. All right. So can you explain to me what DACA is and also what DALCA is?
Right.
DACA and DALCA.
Yes, I mentioned those. The DALCA is not very well known because it's a much smaller group of people. But the DACA children, I'm sure most Americans would have heard of DACA. DACA stands for Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. Now, what has happened over the last 25 years is that undocumented immigrants have come through the southern border or however they've come here. Many of them have come legally. They've come legally on a B1, B2, which is a tourist visa, and then just overstayed their visa. So not all of them have come through the border, but many of them, have come on planes or boats. So what Obama did in his administration was he recognized that young children that had not been born here, children aged from 1, 2, 3, 4, even up to teenagers, had come with their parents to the United States and had just gone into the system. They'd lived here, the parents were working, the kids had gone to school, but they were living under the radar. Like many undocumented people do, they live under the radar. But the children had only known America as their home, especially if they were brought here as an infant. So now we had all these children in the 20 teens that some of them couldn't even speak a home language. And the government recognized that these children had no opportunities to study, to go to college, to do anything with their lives, to get a job, unless they were given some kind of special treatment because it was not their fault that they had been brought here by their by their parents. We read, I think even from biblical times, the parents cannot be held responsible for, or the children cannot be held responsible for their parents' actions, right? That is a fundamental piece of law. And that's what Obama applied when he decided to do that executive order granting, I think, up to 1 million people, 1 million children at that time, deferred action for being a childhood arrival. And so that was very controversial at the time, but in my mind, it was the only thing to do correctly, rightly, morally, because the children are not responsible for having been brought here. They were grabbed by the hand and they were tagged in here and they were told, this is where we're going and you're coming with me. They had no say in the matter. Alternatively, on the other side, and the reason why I got involved with the DALCA movement, DALCA, which stands for Deferred Action for Legal Childhood Arrivals. So, for example, my daughter, who was brought here at the age of 9 or 10, she came as a legal immigrant. She was on my L1A, she was an L1B visa holder. But when she got to 21, she had no more protection. She had to get her own visa or she had to leave the country. So there's a whole group of children that came here with parents legally, and many of them are from India. Parents came here on an H1B visa to work in the tech industry. The children came as little children, and once they got to 21, they had to go back to a country that they'd never known. So a whole movement of parents got together, including me, and we marched on Washington. We had a big demonstration there. Now, what about the legal children that came with legal parents, whose parents now cannot get permanent residency, and their children, and the children are now sent away and the families are torn apart? So I hope that explains what the difference between, because if we thought that if the undocumented immigrant children could get DACA, why could our DALCA children who came legally not get the same protection until their family's immigration was resolved? Right? Doesn't that make sense?
It makes sense. It seems logical, which is probably why Congress can't complete the process, because it's too logical.
Yep.
All right. So speaking of Congress and our government officials, just last month here in the United States, we had a presidential election and Donald Trump was reelected after one term out of office. So let's go through some of the potential, I don't know if consequences is the right term, but some of the potential pitfalls for the next few years with President Trump, Congress, Project 2025, and Stephen Miller in the White House, how they can all impact U.S. immigration over the next 4 years.
Well, the only, I can't predict how they're going to behave, but I can look at their previous administration behavior, and I can look to Project 2025, which I have read. And from those two perspectives, I think that we can expect lots of upheaval. I think we can expect Stephen Miller, who is anti-immigration of any nature. He says we have enough immigrants here, we need to shut our borders, and we need to work on our country and make it great. As they keep on saying, we're going to work on our country to make it great. The only problem is that unfortunately, looking at history over the last 150 years, America has only really been great and grown dramatically when there has been a surge of immigration. There's a direct correlation between large amounts of immigrants coming to the US and the economy surging ahead. Why? Because we have cheap labor, we have people that are prepared to work hard, there's an immigrant ethos, there's an immigrant way of thinking. You will notice that very few people in America who are immigrants are homeless. You do not see homeless people on the street that are immigrants. They are out there working. They are out there picking fruit. They're out there replacing roofs. They're out there washing dishes. They are not on the street homeless. And so immigrants have always come here with bright eyes and expectation. And I think that that's really the crux of the matter, is that if Trump shuts down immigration and he deports all of our people that are vulnerable here, that are undocumented, that are doing a job, I think the impact on native-born Americans is going to be catastrophic, because white-owned businesses or American-owned businesses that are employing large numbers of undocumented people are going to come to a standstill. And it's going to affect the owners and it's going to affect the management. Because if they don't have workers in the factory or in the fields, they're going to have to fire their management, their American managers, because there is no work. So I think the implications are dire. And I sit on some committees with immigration attorneys, and they are incredibly worried about the fact that when Trump took over in 2016, he virtually shut down immigration. He just ground the whole thing to a standstill. And then, of course, we had the added impact of COVID, which impacted immigration enormously. I have legal immigrant clients that have been waiting in South Africa since 2019, and they are only coming to the US this December. That is 5 years of waiting. And they invested in the EB-5 program, which is the Rolls-Royce investment visa program. They've invested $800,000 in a project, many of them in Texas, and they've had to wait 5 years. So as you can see, and just a little interesting aside is that the Kushners, the Trumps, and many others in his circle have used EB-5 investment money from around the world for decades to build their hotels and their construction projects. So they are very aware of the EB-5 program. So whether they are going to support that, we don't know. We have no idea. But what I can tell you is that there's going to be, if they say that they're going to deport all these people, you better believe them. And I think he's going to start in Florida, which is his own backyard. I think he's going to start there and then move across the country. And I think it's going to have dire consequences. And I think Americans are going to be very angry at what they're seeing happening. That's my personal opinion. And I hope I'm not right. But if what we believe, what we read and what we've seen, I think we need to buckle up for something.
Wow. Okay, well, we just have a couple of questions left before we wind down this conversation. And I want to give you a chance to talk about how you offer, what support you offer to immigrants and how they can contact you. I'll put some links in the show notes. But just tell about some of the businesses one of the businesses that you run helping immigrants.
Thank you, Melvin. When I went through all of my trauma, I realized that I didn't have a mentor. I didn't have a consultant. I didn't have anybody who could educate me upfront about what I was walking into. I had nobody to share with me how to open a bank account, what to do with Social Security, how the health insurance worked here, how the education system worked here. I had nobody to guide me. I got here, I had no credit score. Nobody told me that in America you have to have a credit score. Your life revolves around what your credit score is. So you won't be getting a cell phone, you won't be getting a credit card, you won't be able to buy a vehicle, and you certainly won't be able to get a mortgage. If somebody had been able to teach me all of that before I came, my life would have been so much easier. I was lucky enough to have resources at the time. Obviously, we burned through those very fast, but we did have resources in the beginning to keep us going. But most immigrants that come here don't understand the way we do business here and the sensible way to run your life here and what the long-term implications are. That, if you're going to pay into Social Security by the time you get to 65, you're going to get Medicare. I didn't understand any of that. Nobody told me that. So when I turned 65, I am still four credits short of my Medicare qualification, because back in the day when I got here, nobody told me you need to pay that. In fact, one of our accountants told us you didn't need to pay into Social Security because you weren't a citizen. I mean, how stupid was that advice? Now I'm paying for it, you see. So my business, which is Pathway USA, relocates immigrants of all kinds, not only wealthy ones from all over the world. And we literally roll out the red carpet for them. But we start working with them a year before they get here, because the processing time takes a while. It takes time. And we use that time in order to build those very important building blocks for their future life here. So that's me in a nutshell.
Okay. And again, I'll have some links in the show notes so that anyone who's interested can click and get more details and find out how to contact you directly if they need your services. And I do recommend that. So for the last question here, during this Christmas season, what message do you have for immigrants and the battle they face to become American citizens?
Well, it's a tough battle. It can be a very long battle, but keep the faith. Prayer was my best friend in many dark days when I never knew that I would ultimately be a citizen and I would ultimately be legal. I believe that my faith has sustained me through many, many hard days, many confusing days. Should I leave the country? Should I go back to my home country? What should I do? So I really encourage people at this Christmas time to keep the faith. If this is where you want to be bad enough, fight for it. Fight for it, because I still believe America is a nation of laws, a nation of opportunity, a nation of very kind and generous people. And so at this time, I think, enjoy that, hold on to that. I still believe in the United States of America.
Well, that is a great way to wind up this episode. I know I said "wow" a lot of times during during this dialogue, but this is a subject that I'm just not well versed on. I'm sure, like most Americans, and this has been eye opening for me. So I really appreciate you, Dianne. So our guest today has been immigration expert and native South African Dianne Ennis Stewart. Dianne, thanks so much for joining me today. It's been a pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you so much, Melvin. It's been an honor to share my story a little bit with you. Thank you.
Thank you. So if you're new here, please subscribe and follow this podcast so that you never miss an episode. And please share it with a friend. I'd greatly appreciate that. And you can also find out more details about each episode's guest on my website at www.podcastreallife.com. And you can learn more about how to financially support the podcast if that's something that you desire to do as well. So that's it for this week's episode of Stories from Real Life. Join us again next time for another great storytelling journey. Until then, don't forget to shine your light wherever you go.